welcome back. Today I want to talk about all of the books I read in the past month. In October I read 9 books in total. 7 of them were fantasy romance and 2 of them were fantasy. Technically one of the fantasy books were lit RPG, which is a subset of fantasy and sci-fi, but same thing. 9 books is honestly a lot of books for me in 1 month. I know it's not as much as some people, but I'm a very slow reader. So if I read that many books, it just means I read for a very long time this past month. But October started off really strong for me. At the beginning of the month, I had 2 5-star reads right off the bat. And then it just went slowly downhill from there to the point where I'm honestly feeling like I'm about to be in a reading slump. So I'm hoping for a good book soon. But let's just get into it and go over all the books I read in the past month. We will go in order from what I read at the beginning of the month to the very last book I read at the end of October. The first book I read in October was The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I cannot believe it took me this long to finally start on my Brandon Sanderson journey because I loved this book so much. It was 5 stars for me. I know everyone hypes up Brandon Sanderson's books, and let's be real, he's one of the most popular fantasy authors, but I just kept putting this off for whatever reason, and I honestly regret not reading this sooner because I am obsessed and I can't wait to finish this trilogy and then continue on to his other books. The Final Empire is about the undertaking of overthrowing an empire that has been ruling the lands for over 1,000 years. We follow the main character Vin, and then obviously there is a bunch of side characters. And let me say, Brandon Sanderson is fantastic at writing characters. Characters have a lot of depth, and I just really appreciated the way they were written, and I felt like I could connect with them, which is not always the case in all books. This book also has a hard magic system with medals, which is my first time reading a book with a hard magic system, which I loved. I thought it was very fun to learn about, and I liked knowing the exact way the magic system worked. And overall, this book was just fantastic. I loved the world building, the plot was great, and I felt like every chapter in this book was very necessary, whereas some books can sometimes have some fluff, but every chapter made sense in this, and there's a lot of foreshadowing, a lot of tension, and it all builds up to this one thing, and I just loved it so much. If you are new to Brandon Sanderson like I am, I do think this is a really good place to start. Next up, I read Storm of Secrets and Sorrow by Melissa K. Rorich. This is the second book in the Legacy series. This is my all-time favorite dark fantasy romance series. I've only read the first 2 books. Literally the 3rd book just came out, so I want to get my hands on that so I can read it. And then the 4th and final book is supposed to come out next year in 2025. So depending on how I like those books, this might become my all-time favorite fantasy romance series. I cannot explain to you how much I love this story, and I'm just so invested into all the characters and to know what happens next and how the entire story is going to wrap up. I went into this series completely blind, and honestly that's what I recommend. I liked that I did not know anything about it. The only thing I knew is that it was dark fantasy romance. So I'm not going to explain what this book is about because I think you should also go into this blind because I think that is the best way to do it. But this series has so many true morally gray characters. You want to root for them, but then you also hate them. It's just very back and forth. And the ending of the 2nd book had me on the edge of my seat. I cannot wait to see what happens in the 3rd book. This series also has multiple POVs, so if you like that and you're also interested in dark fantasy romance, I would definitely check this series out. Since this is a dark fantasy romance series, there are some trigger warnings, so I would just look those up to see if it is something you can handle. And if that is okay with you, then I definitely think you should read this series, and hopefully you will love it as much as I do. And if it is not already clear by my love for this series, both the 1st and 2nd book were 5 stars for me. It is not common for the 1st book in a series to be 5 stars for me, so that just tells you how much I truly love this series. The 3rd book I read in October was Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman. This book is so much fun. This is a lit RPG book. It is basically about the apocalypse, and it's like a reality game show type of deal. We follow this main character Carl and his ex-girlfriend's Kat, where they're thrown into this video game show type of deal, and you just follow them through trying to survive the end of the world and being on this twisted game show. And in this there are skill levels, there are special weapons, there's monsters, there's so many different things. If you are a video game fan, I think you will absolutely love this. In the game show there are 18 levels total. In this first book we go through the first 2 levels levels. And there's currently, I believe, 7 books out. So I'm assuming each book goes over like 2 or 3 levels. I've already bought the second book, so I'm ready to read that because honestly, this book is so good as a palate cleanser. Like if you just need some good old escapism and something fun to hold your attention, I would 100% recommend this book. I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. It didn't end up giving me that 5-star feeling, but it was super fun and I would highly recommend it. Back to fantasy romance, the next book I read was Heartless Hunter by Kristen Cicerelli. This is a YA fantasy romance book. This book is about a witch and a witch hunter. It is a true enemies to lovers book. Some books say they're enemies to lovers, but they are definitely not. They just haven't communicated enough. And once they finally do, they realize they like each other. But this truly is enemies to lovers. I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. I really enjoyed it, but it definitely didn't change my life by any means. I like the witchy vibes and the overall plot. The atmospheric vibes in this were fantastic. It's very rainy and stormy. It feels very cozy in fall winter vibes. So if you need some good fall vibes, I would definitely check out this book. However, I didn't fully connect to the characters. It might have to do with the fact that this is only like 400 pages and it's YA, so it went very quickly and I just didn't have time to connect to them. But I just found myself not totally caring what happened to the characters in this book. But I did enjoy the overall vibes and story enough to where I will continue on to the second book when it comes out, because this is an easy read and it was enjoyable enough for me to continue, but I wouldn't write home about it. Next up, I read Quicksilver by Callie Hart, which I am sure all of you have already heard of. It is literally everywhere on the internet right now. This is, of course, another fantasy romance book. I am pretty conflicted about how I feel about this book. I did not love it and I did not hate it, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. I felt like the plot was kind of all over the place throughout the book. Like it had so many different ideas and it felt like it had different ideas from several different books and it just smashed them all into this one book. And I am a plot-driven girl and there was some points I even thought it dragged on a bit. I did really end up liking all the characters in this book, which it is not common for me to like all the characters in a book, but I did with this one, so that is something to be said about this. However, because the plot and overall storytelling was a little bit all over the place for me, I ended up giving it 3 stars. I was entertained enough reading this. If you have been interested in picking up this book, I would recommend giving it a shot, because I can absolutely see why some people would love this book, but I can also see why someone would hate it. And so I was right kind of down the middle. I can see both sides. But I do think I will pick up the second book whenever that comes out, because I did like the ending, and so I am interested enough to know what happens next. Next up, I read Split or Swallow by Lindsay Straub. This is not normally a book I'd pick up on my own, but I was seeing it everywhere and the concept sounded so crazy to me that I had to pick it up and give it a try. I made an entire video dedicated to this book, so if you are interested in that, I will link it down below in the description for you. This is easily the spiciest, smuttiest book I have ever read. Easily 5 chili peppers, which is not really my jam personally, but the concept intrigued me. In this book, there are these hot snake men who train women on how to be good in bed in order for the chance to become the prince's future wife. Basically, they go through this training and whoever the prince thinks is the best in bed will be the winner and the future wife of the prince. That is this book in simple terms. This book is honestly all over the place. It feels like the focus was on the spice and the smut, and then the plot was just kind of thrown in there. So it is absolute chaos throughout this book. I did not like this book. It was just not for me. Personally, I give it 2 stars just because the plot was so wild. I was like, I need to give credit where credit is due. But if you are interested in a super spicy, smutty book that just has a plot that is absolute bananas, then maybe check this one out. The 7th book I read this past month was Gild by Raven Kennedy. This is the first book in the Plated Prisoner series, which is a dark fantasy romance series that is a King Midas retelling. This book is pretty popular. I have seen a lot of good things about this series and a lot of bad things, so it seems pretty divisive in whether you love it or hate it. This first book was not good. I gave it 2 stars. I have heard though that the first book is not very good and then the second and third book get a lot better. which I can see being true because I did actually really like the ending of this book. And based on how this ended, it did make me curious as to how the second book is going to go. I do have higher hopes for the second book. I actually did end up purchasing both the second and third book to this series, and so I will be reading those. For whatever reason, even though I didn't like this first book, I have a feeling I will like the next two books more, and then I'm just determined to read this entire series at this point. I won't go into too much about this book because it is pretty short, so I feel like it's just best to go in pretty blind. But it is about a gold girl who is stuck in this cage in King Midas's palace. The cage is really big, actually. She can go room to room. And so the first like 200 pages or so, I think she's in the cage, and then she does obviously eventually leave the cage because we can't spend the entire series in a cage. And so once she actually got out of that, I did find the story a little bit better. But overall in this first book, the story just was not very good. Not a ton happened, and I couldn't really connect to any of the characters. But this is a very quick read. It is under 400 pages, I believe, and the pages are pretty short. This book does go really quickly, so if you have been interested in picking this series up, I would give it a try because even if you don't like it, it does go very quickly, and maybe give the first two books a try like I'm doing and then decide how you want to go from there, since it's pretty universal that people do not like this first book. I am still holding out hopes for the second and third book, and then there are 6 books in total. They are all out now, so it is now officially a completed series. So I'm hoping to finish the whole series. However, I've heard the second half of the series kind of goes downhill and it should have just been kept as a trilogy. So I'm curious to see if I agree with that, but I have dedicated myself to this series now regardless. We have 2 books to go. The 8th book I read was This Woven Kingdom by Tahera Mafi. This is a Persian-inspired fantasy romance book. It is YA. This is another book I do think it is best to go into fairly blind and not know too much about it. But we follow this main character who is posing as a servant, but she is like a long forgotten lost queen. And then we also get a guy's perspective who is a prince. This book is about clashing empires, a forbidden romance, a long forgotten queen who needs to reclaim her throne. And it is a very well written book. I didn't personally love it. However, that has to do more with me than the book itself because it was well written, but it came off very literary fiction. It is very character based. Not a ton happens in this book. And so I found it personally a little bit slow and hard to get through because I am someone who likes a lot of world building and a very plot driven book, and I like a lot of action. So for this to be so focused on the characters, it was a little bit slow for me. Even though it is very character heavy, I didn't totally connect with the characters in this book. So for those reasons, I did end up giving this 3 stars. However, take my opinion with a grain of salt because I can see this being a 5-star book for the right person because it is very well written. I will be picking up the second book in this series and giving that book a try because I did really enjoy the ending of this book, and a new character was introduced towards the end of the book who I actually really liked. And so I'm curious to see how the second book will go. I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy that one a lot more than this first book. So this book was 3 stars for me, but I do think this series has really high potential, and I do think it can be amazing for the right person. There are currently 3 books out in this series. I believe it is going to be 5 books in total, but only the first 3 are released currently, and then I have no idea when the last 2 books are supposed to be released. But I do think this series has a lot of potential, so I will be continuing on at least the second book, and then I will go from there. If you like a fantasy book that is a little more character driven and reads more literary, I do think you will really like this. Last but not least, I read Reign and Ruin by J.D. Evans. This is a very plot heavy fantasy romance book. It is pretty underrated. It has just over 5,000 ratings on Goodreads, whereas some of these other books that I have talked about have more than 100,000, I believe. So in comparison, this is very underrated. And I did actually really end up enjoying this book. I gave it 4.25 stars. And in this book, we follow the female main character who is a princess and a hire, and she wants to rule her country so that she can protect them, but she's expected to marry and hand over her power to her husband, which obviously she is not down for. And so in this book, we're really just focusing on the political aspect of this and her trying to become ruler of her kingdom and how she is going to do that. And in this, we do get both the females and the male's perspective. The male main character is from a different kingdom, and he is an unwanted wanted prince who has the power to destroy. And these two characters have very similar opinions and goals for what they want for their kingdoms, whereas a lot of other people in both of their kingdoms have the opposite opinions. And so these two characters end up connecting, and it is a very good, wholesome, slow burn romance. What I really appreciated about the romance in this book is that they actually get to know one another, and it isn't just lust based. And the intimate scenes were very well written, probably one of the best book couples I have read so far. So it is a slow burn romance. This book is very plot heavy and there's a lot of political intrigue. I ended up giving it 4.25 stars because I did find it just a tiny bit slow for me. It was so focused on that one thing and there wasn't too much happening, and I would have liked to see more action and more going on, and so for those reasons it wasn't a 5-star read. But I do recommend this book if you do enjoy a more plot heavy political intrigue fantasy romance book. There are 5 books in a series. There are 4 in the main series and then there's 1 prequel. I will be picking up the next book and seeing how I like that. Each book focuses on a different couple, which I'm excited for, but also I feel like this one book was not enough time with this couple. But I am curious to see how I will like the next book, and I'm hoping it's a little bit quicker than this first book. I'm not sure if these characters will be featured in later books at all, but I am excited to continue and I do recommend checking out this book. And that is all 9 books that I read in October. We had some really good reads, some not so great reads, and then some in the middle books. I feel like a lot of the books I read this past month were very plot heavy and a little bit slower. So I think I need to pick up something a little bit quicker so I can make sure I don't get into a full-on reading slump. But anyways, let me know if you have read any of these books and your thoughts on them. And down in the comments below, let me know your favorite and least favorite read from October. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video and making it this far. I appreciate you so much. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next one. I love you. Bye.